Our topic this morning is faith. And let me begin with one of my favorite stories, set in a very crowded, stuffy, kosher restaurant in New York. And in New York, you know, in the summer it gets very hot and very humid. And one of the customers summons over the waiter and says, "Waiter, it's too hot in here, put on the air conditioner." The waiter goes out. 5 minutes later, the man summons the waiter back and says, "Waiter, now it's too cold in here, switch off the air conditioning." The waiter disappears a second time. 5 minutes later, lo and behold, the same man summons him over and says, "Waiter, it's now too hot again, put on the air conditioning." For the third time, the waiter leaves the room. And just as he's about to leave, another diner stops him and says, "Waiter, I feel so sorry for you. This man must be driving you mad." And the waiter says, "No, actually, I'm driving him mad. You see, there is no air conditioning." From which I conclude that what we think in here affects what we feel out there. Now, we may think that faith, emunah, is in the big empirical world out there a small thing, a fragile thing, in the immortal words of Sir Elton John, a candle in the wind, easily extinguished. But I don't think it's quite so. I don't know what the economic climate is in South Africa. The physical climate is just beautiful, but what the economic climate is, I don't know. But as you probably know, Europe is in the middle of a financial crisis and an economic recession that has lasted now for 5 years. And the reason for it has been a loss of confidence on the part of investors, loss of trust in banks and financial institutions, and a drying up of credit. Now just think of those three things for a moment. Confidence. The word confidence comes from the Latin fides, which means faith. The word credit comes from the Latin word credo, which is the Latin for ani ma'amin, I believe. And as for trust, well, that's bitachon, or bitachon, or what have you. You have something here called CSO, am I right? They look after security. And I always say to the security guys, we have one word in Hebrew that is pronounced two ways. Bitachon and bitachon. Bitachon means security, and bitachon means trust. So I always say to my CST people, you look after the bitachon and I'll look after the bitachon. But in other words, the whole economy of the West right now depends on these deeply psychological, you could even call them spiritual states of mind. Faith, belief, and trust. So it is not just in Jewish restaurants in New York, it is the market economy where what we feel in here affects the reality out there. And that is a way of understanding that faith or lack of it makes all the difference, not just a little difference, and not only just to those who believe. Now, religious faith has come in, certainly in Europe and America, for some tremendous battering. Have the new atheists reached the shore, South Africa yet? Richard Dawkins and people like that? I'm afraid I'm a little mischievous about these guys. I wrote a piece in an English journal, The Spectator, this week, Erev Shabbos this week, in which I said about the new atheists what one Oxford academic said about another. He said, on the surface, he's profound. But deep down, he's superficial. So the new atheists are quite minor, but faith has been under attack ever since the 18th century, from David Hume all the way to Bertrand Russell. In fact, Jews did pretty well at apocosis ourselves. I mean, let's remember that three of the world's, the greatest apikos, and three of the four in the modern world were Jewish: Spinoza, Marx, and Freud. The only one who wasn't Jewish was Charles Darwin. Why Charles Darwin wasn't Jewish, I don't know. Had all the qualifications of being a total apikoris, he should have been Jewish. It must have been a random genetic mutation. So let us therefore not bother with the minor challenges to faith, but with the really big ones. The three great challenges to faith in the modern world. Number one, the challenge from science. Do we really need religion to explain the world? As Laplace put it in the 18th century, when people asked him where was God in his scientific system, he replied, "Je n'ai besoin de cette hypothèse." I don't need that hypothesis, God, to explain the world. So, first is the challenge from science. Second, and this is a very deep challenge, the challenge from evil. If God is good and God rules the world, how is it that bad things happen to good people? To put it bluntly, this is the challenge from the Holocaust. Where was God at Auschwitz? And finally, what I call the existential challenge. Who needs it? To cure a sickness nowadays, you don't need a Rav, you go to a doctor. To cure poverty, you don't need prayer, you go to an economist. To confess, to do vidui, you don't need to do vidui anymore, you can go to a psychotherapist. And if you're depressed, you don't need Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms, you can take a pill. Whatever religion once did, today we have someone else doing something else. So those are the three challenges. So let's begin with the challenge from science. And here I want to tell you a story that happened to me some years ago. See, Cambridge University asked me about 10 years ago, before Richard Dawkins had published and Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens, they asked me to do a public conversation on religion and science with the then professor of the history of science at Cambridge. It was a wonderful, wonderful occasion, very lovely debate. And as we were leaving the lecture hall, a man came up to me, a very modest man, you know, just somebody in the audience, and said to me, "Chief Rabbi, I've written a book that I think you may find interesting. I'll send it to you." I didn't know who he was. And a week later, the book arrived. It was called Just 6 Numbers. And I suddenly realized who this stranger was. He was Sir Martin, now Lord Rees, then Astronomer Royal, later Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, later President of the Royal Society, the oldest and greatest scientific society in the world, the one of which Isaac Newton was a member, and the winner in 2010 of the Templeton Prize. In other words, one of the most eminent scientists in the world today. And what he shows in his book, Just 6 Numbers, is that the entire shape and fabric of the universe depends on 6 mathematical constants, like the force of gravity, the strong and the weak nuclear force, and so on. And he shows in this book the extraordinary fact that if any of those 6 constants had been different, even by a millionth or a billionth or a billionth of a billionth degree, then we would never have had a universe, or at least a universe from which life might emerge. For instance, had the force of gravity been weaker, then after the Big Bang, the universe would have expanded and continued to expand, and no matter would ever have coalesced to form stars, and then planets, and then us. If the force of gravity had been even slightly stronger, then after the Big Bang, the universe would have expanded and then contracted, resulting in what they call a big crunch. In other words, if the force of gravity had been even slightly different, we would never have had a universe. And so it is with all the other 5 constants. The likelihood of those things happening by chance is, as somebody has said, as likely as you or me throwing a dart and hitting bullseye in a dartboard at the other end of the universe, 13.7 billion light years away. It just could not have happened by chance. Now, Rees is not a religious believer. He is an agnostic. But he acknowledges that his own findings as a scientist challenge him as an agnostic. How can I possibly explain that this universe came about by chance? It is impossible that it could have come about by chance. And there is only one way that this scientist, indeed many scientists, but Rees is among the very greatest of the great, there is only one way he can explain it without invoking God, namely by assuming an infinite number of parallel universes. In other words, there's just an infinity of universes, and our muzzle is that we just happen to be in the universe that contains us. Or as they used to say, this is a Yiddish joke, but you need a PhD to understand it. Let me try it on you. You know, the guy in Chelm says, you know, seeing all the suffering in this world, maybe it would have been better not to have been born. But how many are so lucky? Not 1 in 1,000. Anyway, so our muzzle was we were born on the universe that contains human beings and us. Anyway, the only trouble with this as a scientific explanation is that there is no evidence whatsoever for any other universe than this one. There may well be an infinity of parallel universes, but outside of science fiction, there is no evidence of them whatsoever. And there is a principle in logic called Occam's razor, which says that if you have 2 alternative explanations to choose from, choose the one that involves the fewest possible number of unexplained entities. In other words, if you have a choice between believing in an infinity of universes for which you have no evidence at all, or believing in one God who created the world, finely tuned for the emergence of life, the God hypothesis has to win on logical grounds alone. So that is the first issue of contemporary science, that there is no plausible way of explaining the physical universe without invoking an intelligent creator or some wild hypothesis that we have no evidence for. Secondly, life itself. Despite all the scientific conjectures, we still have no idea, not even the hint of an idea, of how life emerged from inanimate matter. Even the simplest life forms are so complicated in relation to the basic chemical and physical building blocks of the universe that there's no way of getting from here to there. And the only way, for instance, a complete, really from atheist like Francis Crick, the late Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, the structure of DNA, the only way Francis Crick can explain the emergence of life on Earth is to say it came from Mars. From this, he makes a living. I mean, how did it begin in Mars? Go figure, you know. So problem 1, the existence of a finely tuned universe. Problem 2, the emergence of animation from inanimate matter. Or take life, number 3, as it is today. There are at least 3 million species of living things. And what is fascinating is that since Crick and Watson identified the structure of DNA in 1953, all the way to the decoding of the human genome in 2001, we now know this, for which we never had any knowledge before. We now know that all life, from the simplest bacterium to us, comes from one single source. All of life is composed of the same DNA, of the same 4 letters of the genetic code. All lives, in other words, everything that lives, kol haneshama ta'alinyo, everything that lives is structured in the same script, carries the same handwriting. And the idea that every form of living thing comes from one source is the most religious idea that science perhaps has ever come up with. So powerful is this, that the leader of the team to decode the human genome, Francis Collins, began that project as an atheist and ended it as a religious believer. And of course, every year, new discoveries emerge that are more and more challenging for the atheist or the agnostic. For instance, there was a wonderful discovery last September. I don't know if you know this. When they decoded the human genome, they discovered that only 2% of these 3.1 billion letters of the genetic code, only 2% of the genome coded for protein, which is what the DNA does. In other words, 98% of the human genome performed seemingly no function whatsoever. And they called this junk DNA. 98% of the human genome, said the scientists in 2001, is junk DNA. Now, I had a conversation with Richard Dawkins last September, and Hashem brought it about, a little bit of hashgacha prodis, that 5 days before that conversation, the results were published of one of the largest collaborative scientific experiments was published. This is a series of experiments conducted over 10 years involving 450 scientists, 160 experiments, and 34 scientific institutions. And you know what they discovered? That the 98% of junk DNA that was thought to be junk isn't junk at all. Every bit of it is absolutely essential for life. Among other things, that 98% codes for the production of 4 million switches that switch on and off the bits of the DNA, the bits of the genes that we need at any given moment. It is a series of instructions for genetic switching, genetic expression. So it turns out that 98% that was dismissed as junk isn't junk at all. So I said to Richard Dawkins, is it true that scientists believed that 98% of the human genome was junk? He said, yes. I said, have scientists now discovered that it's absolutely essential for life? He said, yes. I said, Richard, do you think that 98% of religion is junk? Might you not be wrong about that as well? And do you know what his answer was? No, neither do I. He didn't answer at all. So there you are. That is the challenge from science. That the more science we know, the more we understand more Rabu Ma'asecha Hashem, Kulam b'chokhmah asita, how wondrous are your works, you have made them all in wisdom. Today, science challenges the atheist, not the believer. That is number one. Number two, though, is a much harder challenge, the argument from evil. And I'm not even going to try in a few minutes to attempt to answer the greatest question of faith of all, the question of tzaddik v'ralo, why bad things happen to good people. In the space of a few minutes, it is sufficient to point out one remarkable feature of Judaism. In other religions, the question about evil is usually asked by the people at the fringes of faith, the skeptics, the radicals, the doubters. In Judaism, this question is asked not by the doubters, but by the heroes of faith themselves. Avraham Avinu, Hashovet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Abraham says, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Moses says, Lama ha're'ezel ha'am hazeh. Why have you done evil to this people? Jeremiah, in the beginning of chapter 12, says, Hashem, you win every argument that I have with you, but I still want to know, why is it that the wicked prosper? The entire book of Job is dedicated to this question. So this is a question of questions, and there can be no facile answer to it. However, I do want to say something about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not in and of itself a new challenge to faith. Exactly the same question could have been asked about the first two human children, Cain and Abel. Why did Hashem let Cain kill Abel? He knew that Cain was angry with Abel. He knew that Cain was harboring murderous thoughts. He asked Cain, why are you angry? You know that sin is crouching at the door. You can dominate it, but it wants to dominate you. Why did God let Cain kill Abel? And the truth is that that is the Jewish equation. We believe that God gave us freedom. It is the most faithful decision he made in the entire universe. Freedom means that if we do well, we are a little lower than the angels. But if we do bad, we are lower even than the beasts. That is our world. God teaches us what is good and what is evil, what we should do and what we should not do. But he does not intervene to force us to do good or to prevent us from doing evil. In 1995, the BBC asked me to make a film at Auschwitz for the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I had never been to Auschwitz before. I didn't want to go. I went. And I stood there in the middle of Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time. And I suddenly knew where God was at Auschwitz. He was there in the words, Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. In the words, V'ger lo tanu, do not oppress the stranger. In the words, Kol demei achicha tzoakim li min ha'adama, your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. But in one sense, the Holocaust changed the whole human equation. Let me explain why. The culture that produced the Holocaust was not at some distant place or time. It took place in the heart of the most sophisticated culture the world has ever known. A culture that had reached the very heights of human achievement in science, in philosophy, in rationalism, in democracy. This was the culture of Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, the culture of Goethe and Schiller and Bach and Beethoven, the people who signed the Wannsee Declaration in January 1942, the final solution aimed at the elimination, Rahman al-Islam, of all of Europe's 11 million Jews, of the people sitting around that table resolving on that plan. Half of them, more than half of them, carried the title doctor. They were either medical doctors or they had doctorates. And that was just Germany. France, the country that gave us the revolution in 1789, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, les droits de l'homme et de le citoyen. That country was the country that produced Louis Drummond, who wrote one of the most anti-Semitic books ever written, La France Juive, in the 1880s, which went through 200 editions between then and 1945. It was a bestseller for 60 years. France was the country of the Dreyfus trial. France was the country that actively collaborated with the Nazis and rounded up Jews for deportation without even being asked by the Nazis. As for Vienna, Vienna, the cultural capital of Europe, was the epicenter of anti-Semitism. Its mayor, Karl Lueger, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the man who turned Adolf Hitler into an anti-Semite. When the Austrians voted on the Anschluss, 97% of the population voted in favor of Hitler. And that was the country that made its chief rabbi, Rabbi Dr. Taglich, get down on his knees and scrub the pavements of Vienna while the Viennese stood and laughed. Austria was the country where, in March 1938, at the time of the Anschluss, 500 Jews committed suicide, knowing what was going to happen. They played string quartets at Auschwitz-Birkenau as 1.25 million Jews and gypsies and homosexuals were gassed and burned and turned to ash. After the Holocaust, some people lost their faith, some people kept their faith, and some people found faith in God. But after the Holocaust, it is morally impossible to believe in man. I say this not lightly. The Holocaust is the final decisive refutation of the idea that you can have a humane civilization without Yirat Shamayim, without the fear of heaven, and without a belief in sanctity of life. The Holocaust may make some people lose their faith in God, but it must make all people lose their faith in humankind. Without Yirat Shamayim, homo hominem lupus est. Man is like a wild animal to man. After Auschwitz, you have to be either very ignorant or very naive to believe in secular humanism. The real challenge of the Shoah is not to faith, but to lack of faith. And finally, at the existential level, do we still need religion? Well, in Europe, they've decided we really don't. Europe is the most secular civilization that the world has ever known. And of course, for 50 years, since the 1960s, Europe has by and large lost its religious faith. The only trouble is this: certain things began to happen when people stopped believing in God. Number one, in those same 50 years, the family and marriage have collapsed almost completely. Today in Britain, 40% of children are born outside of marriage. 50% of marriages end in divorce. The result is, among other things, an entirely new phenomenon in Britain of child poverty. In Britain, despite its affluence, 3.4 million children live in poverty. In Britain and in Europe, in 50 years, among young people, there has been between a 300% and 1,000% rise in alcohol and drug abuse, in eating disorders, in suicides, Rahman al-Islam, and attempted suicides, in depressive illness and stress-related syndromes. Lose God, you lose the sanctity of marriage, you lose the family, and children are the victims. Secondly, communities have collapsed. It's very interesting. I don't know if you have the same phenomenon here in Johannesburg, but in January 2012, a British medical, the Macmillan Cancer Research Charity, did a survey and discovered that the average Brit between the ages of 18 and 30 has 237 Facebook friends. When asked on how many of those could you rely in a crisis, the average answer was 2. 1/4 said 1, 1/8 said none. I compare that with a young American family who joined our community in St. John's Wood in London in the summer of 2008. It was a huge wrench for him, his wife, their young family to leave New York and come to London. But you see, he just landed a terrific job, head of Lehman Brothers Europe. Within less than a month, there was no Lehman Brothers. And 3 years later, this young man stood up in our shul on the brink of his return to New York. And he said, I don't know how I or my family could have survived at all without this community. You supported us all the way through. You helped us through the most difficult years of our lives. In a shul, you have real friends, not just Facebook friends. Then there's something they call social capital. You know, the good that we do one another. There is a Harvard sociologist called Robert Putnam, the world's greatest expert on this subject, who wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone. He discovered that more Americans than ever are going tenpin bowling, but fewer than ever are joining bowling clubs, and we're bowling alone. 2 years ago, he published a book called American Grace, saying, no, social capital is still alive and well if you go to a house of worship. Religious people are more likely, he showed by radical empirical research, much more likely than secular people to give to charity, even a secular charity, to volunteer, to help someone in distress, to offer somebody a seat in a bus, to allow another driver to cut in front of you in a queue. That, obviously, these weren't Jewish drivers, so... So it turns out that without religion you lose many of the little acts of kindness that make society a human and humane place. And then finally there's that little thing called trust. In Europe, one after another of our institutions we've lost trust in. Bankers, CEOs, politicians, parliamentarians, journalists, police and media personality. Somehow when people lose faith in God, they lose faith in people also. And even health. Did you know that one of the largest ever health survey in America, involving 28,000 people in a longitudinal study, discovered that regular attendance at a house of worship adds 7 years to your life expectancy? Did you know this? I said to Elaine, if you go regularly to shul, you live 7 years longer, or maybe it just seems 7 years longer. So, friends, if you don't mind losing families, communities, the kindness of strangers, trust, and 7 years of your life, then you can give up faith quite easily. But if you care about those things, religion matters. So I hope that I've shown that we do need faith, and that science is not a challenge, the Holocaust is not a challenge, and personal life is not a challenge. They really are challenges to people who have lost their faith. However, speaking personally, for me, and with this I end, the thing that finally prompted me to write a book about faith, because what I've been talking to you is the subject of a book of mine called The Great Partnership, was a few years ago, the atheists in London decided to take out an advertisement on the London buses. I don't know if you read about this. They paid for London buses to carry the message, probably God doesn't exist. I thought this was, this was a very famous thing. I thought it was so funny, it was terrific. I love that word, probably. Let's think about the word probably. As I've tried to explain to you, if probability were the rule, the universe wouldn't exist. Life wouldn't exist. Homo sapiens wouldn't exist. You wouldn't exist. I wouldn't exist. I have to tell you, nothing interesting is probable. How probable is it that one man whose name was Abraham, who ruled no empire, commanded no army, performed no miracles, delivered no prophecy, would turn out to be the most influential human being that ever lived, still followed today by 2.4 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims, and a few of us, most of whom I think are in this room today? How probable is it that a tiny nation, a mere fraction of 1%, a fifth of 1% of the population of the world, should be assaulted by some of the greatest empires the world has ever known? Egypt of the pharaohs, Assyria, Babylon, the Alexandrian Empire, the Roman Empire, the medieval empires of Christianity and Islam, all the way to the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. Every one of those that seemed invulnerable in its day has died, disappeared, and has been consigned to history. And this tiny people called us can still stand and sing Am Yisrael Chai. How probable is that? Friends, nothing interesting is probable. And that is how I define faith. Faith is the defeat of probability by the power of possibility. And that is what the Jewish people have shown time and again in history, that we defy probability by showing ourselves and through us the world that if you have faith, nothing is impossible. Lack faith and you'll find it's hard even to change yourself. Have faith, and together we can change the world. Thank you very much indeed.